Zombies, a terrifying vision of reanimated flesh. The groaning ghouls who hunger for the brains of the living. These creatures haunt our nightmares and popular culture, but from what part of our consciousness do these fiends reside, and what cultures globally have a special relationship with these brain-craving monsters? Today we will investigate where and how these creatures reside, and why they have such a potent position in our societies and nightmares. Unlike many folkloric creatures, zombies specifically have a relatively short history. That being said, there are monsters across the ages and around the world that highly resemble these creatures in physical appearance as well as in action. The concept of resurrection is as old as humanity itself, but it is important to delineate this against the idea of reanimation. Resurrection involves a being being brought back to life in entirety, body and soul, such as the resurrection of Jesus Christ in Christian texts, or Achilles in the ancient Greek religion. Reanimation, on the other hand, although used as a synonym for resurrection in some cases, in this context means restoring movement and other base functions to a lifeless body. The body can again move its appendages and may even be observed displaying severely reduced versions of kinesthetic traits the living possess, such as feeding or speech. This all goes to emphasise that although some physical and cognitive abilities are restored at a diminished capacity, the essence or soul that once inhabited the body is now gone. There are scientific explanations as to why these traits have become popularised and attributed to the undead. Modern science says corpses can continue to move for over a year after death in eerily conscious ways, such as sitting up or arms moving from the side to stretch forth in a manner we imagine most zombies to famously act. Hair can also appear to grow, as well as teeth apparently being bared. This is a natural process as the skin slowly shrinks and dries. This phenomenon would frighten the average person in our own day and age, so it goes without saying how even more terrifying this would be to someone without a modern knowledge of biological science. Large pieces of cloth wrapped around the body after death, often referred to as burial shrouds, have been found on corpses as old as 8,000 years old. This ritual, as well as a final show of care for the recently deceased, would constrict the body, stopping any post-mortem movement, and to an archaic human, would allow the body and soul to rest. The next possible example of necrophobia, or fear of the dead, comes from Syria 10,000 years ago. Juan José Inabez of the Spanish National Research Council states that an odd ritual had commenced where the heads of long decomposed corpses had been exhumed, then smashed to pieces and reburied separate to their bodies. In an odd mercy, a child's skull, although still taken, had been left undamaged, in contrast to the adult male skulls which had been destroyed. The separating of skulls from the deceased was a common occurrence throughout Stone Age Europe and the Middle East. The specific instance of desecration is what makes this example a possible act of necrophobia. A European example of necrophobia has been found on the island of Scilly. The bodies in question, dating back to the 1st millennium BCE, have been found with rocks weighing them down in an attempt to constrict their movement and possibly save the living inhabitants of the island from their undead ancestors. It is fair to say that witnessing death is a traumatic event for the human species. The confusion an ancient human would experience when their loved ones would again flex and move after seeming to have passed on is something a modern person couldn't comprehend. This trauma, made only worse by slowly watching the body waste away, would have obviously haunted our global cultures. As I previously mentioned, the name zombie is a surprisingly modern invention, but there is a creature that calls through ancient history and shares all the traits of this undead creature in all but name. This is the ghoul, from the Arabic ghoul, from Ghala, meaning to seize. The name Ghallus, in the Sumerian and ancient Mesopotamian religions, refers to a particular type of demon who would carry victims off into the underworld and could be appeased by the sacrifice of a lamb at their altars. Inanna, the goddess of love, war and fertility, is said to have been chased by the Ghallus. During Inanna's descent into the netherworld, it is said that those who accompany the Inanna know no food, know no drink, eat no flower offering and drink no libation. They accept no pleasant gifts. They never enjoy the pleasures of the marital embrace, never have any sweet children to kiss. They tear away the wife from the man's embrace. They snatch the son from the man's knee. They make the bride leave the house of her father-in-law. They take away the child hanging on a wet nurse's breasts. They crush no bitter garlic. They eat no fish. They eat no leeks. They, it was, who accompanied the Inanna. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian myth from 2100 BCE, makes reference to the undead and their potent force. In this poem, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and his companion Enkidu kills Humbaba. Humbaba is an anthropomorphic creature similar to our understanding of an ogre, giant, or demon, and instead his shout is the storm flood, his mouth fire, his breath is death. The goddess Ishtar, impressed by Gilgamesh, attempts to entice him. Gilgamesh rebuffed her advances, and in so invokes her fury. Ishtar commanded her father Anu to release the Bull of Heaven against Gilgamesh and Enkidu, vowing to reanimate the dead if he refuses. Father, make the Bull of Heaven. Let him kill Gilgamesh in the very place he lives. Let the bull glut himself on Gilgamesh. If you do not give me the bull, I will smash in the gates of the netherworld. I will set upon the ruler of the great below. I will make the dead rise, and they will devour the living, and the dead will increase beyond the number of the living. This threat from Ishtar is the very first instance we have of what we would refer to as a zombie apocalypse. The dead rising once more, bereft of their consciousness and under command of a new master, becoming a terrifying plague sent forth to attack the living. There is obviously some form of anthropological myth or cultural memory of the zombie, as they are described in a similar connotation in the Old Testament, where it says that, "This shall be the plague wherein the Lord shall smite all the people that had fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall consume away where they stand on their feet, and their eyes shall consume into their holes, and their tongues shall consume into their mouths." Zechariah 14:12. In Arabic folklore, the ghoul is a monster that dwells in cemeteries and is portrayed in many traditional tales, luring unsuspecting people to their abode where the person is swiftly devoured. Ghul-e Bayambam, a monstrous ghoul that inhabited the mountainous regions of Afghanistan and Iran, is said to have drank blood, preyed on children and devoured them, as well as the dead. In other Middle Eastern sources, the ghoul is a desert-dwelling demon who can shapeshift into creatures at will. The ghoul, most notably, would change into the scavenging hyena. It doesn't take much to imagine being a traveller in the ancient Middle East, coming across the remains of a lost caravan in the deserts. As you crest the nearest sand dune, you are struck with horror as you see a gluttonous beast picking at what remains of the caravan's inhabitants. As you stand there, aghast, the only sound you are met with is the unnerving cackle of a now feasted hyena. During the Islamic Golden Age, many Arabic folk tales were condensed into the book 1001 Nights. It became overwhelmingly popular in Europe when it was translated to English in 1706 CE, and is a major influence in how we perceive the ghoul and the fantasy genre in general. In the Tamil mythology of India, a shaggy-haired creature known as the Pei sought out human battles so it could lap blood from the open wounds of the dying. Still other ghouls emerged in the 18th century Tibetan Book of the Dead, which details the Buddhist journey through death. There, in the dreamlike state known as Bardo, the departed soul encounters the Pishatii ghouls, fierce female beings with bestial heads and an appetite for bones and viscera. The Draugr of the ancient Norse mythology are said to be reanimated inhabitants of the barrows and graves of the Nordic culture. They were often described as possessing superhuman strength, bearing a necrotic, bluey-black colour and reeking of decay. These creatures, as opposed to other similar creatures globally, do not feast on flesh. The Draugr, it seems, is content with protecting the tumuluses and treasures that it was buried with. The modern interpretation of Swedish of the word Draugr has come to mean a pale, ineffectual, and slow-minded person that drags himself along. In German folklore, Nachzehrers, German for eater of remains, literally after-eater, are described as being a particularly terrifying undead creature. This recently deceased person would rise from the grave and attack and kidnap family, friends, and village acquaintances in an attempt to steal them back to the grave and keep them for eternal company. It is unknown whether this was done in an act of calculated malice or an overwhelming need for company. The Nachzehrers is said to be able to drain a victim's life force remotely, which may be why they were associated with a sickness epidemic. A sign someone may become a Nachzerer is if they are seen to devour their own funeral shrouds, an interesting throwback to earlier when we mentioned burial shrouds, where in this case the monster is actively attempting to stop the rituals of a funeral. People could also be at risk of becoming a Nachzerer if they had given the deceased an offering of their possessions in the form of grave goods, if they still had their name stitched into their funeral clothes, if they had open eyes or mouths, red lips, or if their flesh was particularly soft, even in death. In British folklore, we continually find a creature referred to as a revenant, from the Old French word revenant, meaning returning. Augustin Calmet, in the 1751 Common Era, claimed revenants were sorcerers who sucked the blood from their victims, whilst others believe that a revenant is simply a generic term for the undead. An English historian in 1190 Common Era, called William of Newburgh, wrote about revenants, saying, "It would not be easy to believe that the corpses of the dead should sally, I know not by what agency, from their graves, yet they seem to wander about, terrorising the living, before returning to the tombs. These frequent examples have been occurring in our own time, established by abundance of testimony." One of these testimonies, featuring a man of apparently evil conduct, are as follows. A Christian burial indeed he received, although unworthy of it, but it did not much benefit him, for issuing, by the handiwork of Satan, from his grave at night time, and pursued by a pack of dogs with horrible barkings, he wandered through the courts and around the houses, whilst all men made fast their doors, and did not dare to go abroad on any errand whatever from the beginning of the night until sunrise, for fear of meeting and being beaten black and blue by this vagrant monster. Thereupon snatching up a spade of but indifferent sharpness of edge, and hastening to the ceremony, they began to dig, and whilst they were thinking that they would have to dig to a greater depth, they suddenly, before much of the earth had been removed, laid bare the corpse, swollen to an enormous corpulence, with its countenance beyond measure turrid and suffused with blood, with the napkin in which it had been wrapped appeared nearly torn to pieces. The young men, however, spurred on by wrath, feared not, and inflicted a wound upon the senseless carcass, out of which incontinently flowed such a stream of blood that it might have been taken for a leech filled with the blood of many persons. Then, dragging it beyond the village, they speedily constructed a funeral pile, and upon one of them saying that the pestilential body would not burn unless its heart were torn out, the others laid open its side by repeated blows of the blunted spade, and, thrusting in his hand, dragged out the accursed heart. This was torn piecemeal, and the body was now consigned to the flames. In 1090 Common Era, the Abbot of Burton tells of two peasants that died suddenly, their reanimation later that night, and how they were eternally dispatched. The very same day in which they were interred, they appeared at evening, whilst the sun was still up, carrying on their shoulders the wooden coffins in which they had been buried. The whole following night they walked through the paths and fields of the village, now in the shape of men carrying wooden coffins on their shoulders, now in the likeness of bears or dogs or other animals. They spoke to the other peasants, banging on the walls of their houses and shouting, "Move quickly! Move! Get going! Come!" The villagers became sick and started dying, but eventually the bodies of the revenants were exhumed, their heads cut off, and their hearts removed, which ended the spread of the sickness. Now, after scouring the earth and exploring our relationship with the undead, we can finally begin looking at the origins of the zombie specifically. During the European conquest of Africa, explorers met a tribe in the Congo that followed a religion called Petro, which involved worshipping a divine being referred to as Nzambi a Mapungu, the supreme god. This being gathered souls and guided them to the afterlife, but if on this journey the soul offended them in any way, instead, the Nzambi, or souls, would be condemned to an eternity of slavery. During the transatlantic slave trade, many Western and Central African people were stolen to the Americas to work as slaves. In Haiti, the Petro religion was mixed with the religion of the Yobura people, called Vodou. In doing this, a witch doctor class emerged called the Bokar. This witch doctor could apparently control a person similar to how Nzambi and Mapugu could. The victim would have to ingest a potion that would bring them to near death or suspended animation. Wade Davis, a Harvard ethnobotanist, investigated the ingredients of this potion during his travels to Haiti in 1982 CE. He found that two powders were used in the ritual. The first includes a tetrodotoxin, a fatal neurotoxin found in the skin of pufferfish, and the other, a deliriant drug found in the nightshade family. The victims would then be buried, and after being exhumed, they would be under the complete control of the Bokar and a mindless automaton. Davis goes on to hypothesize that because voodoo and the idea of zombies was so prevalent in Haitian culture, and the physical and psychological effects of the concoction were so overwhelming, a victim would fully believe they had become a zombie and would act in such a manner. TTX poisoning can cause a variety of symptoms, from numbness to partial paralysis, which would alter the gait of a person, further indoctrinating witnesses and themselves that the victim was indeed now undead. I feel, after all, this is where superstition and folklore lives, between the apparent and the unexplainable. Humans will always look for explanations, even when the reality is beyond their current scientific understanding. Interestingly though, when science catches up and demystifies the unknown, the creatures we use as an explanation take up a new role in our societies. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, in Bath, England, 1818, Common Era. This novel, grappling with the morals of scientific advancement, is widely considered to be the first science fiction book created. It is no surprise to us that the core of this book features the running theme of this essay, the undead rising once more. Interestingly enough though, instead of unholy spirits or African magic causing this monster to come to life, it is instead hard, uncaring, and ambiguous science that thwarts death. It seems that the idea of undying, or being re-risen, haunts all of human culture. The only difference in its nature is what convincingly could be the conduit to compel this change. Now, we all know that Frankenstein's monster is not a zombie, but the similarities between the two are forthright and obvious. H.P. Lovecraft, famous for creating the Cthulhu mythos, wrote Herbert West's Reanimator as a horror short story in 1922. This narrative follows an unnamed narrator as he recounts his relationship with the title character and the experiments they conduct together on the many cadavers they procure. Lovecraft admits in letters that the short story is a parody of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In this story, though, instead of electricity, in the case of Frankenstein, being used to reanimate the dead, instead a serum is used to restart the bodies. This is, as the undead always seem to be, a way to explore a contemporary fear. Just as how modern science and electricity had been used in Frankenstein, instead now, with the recent discoveries of vaccines for cholera, plague and typhoid, a liquid serum is what brings the dead back to life. The zombie thoroughly entered popular culture with the film White Zombie in 1936 CE, which was based on a 1929 CE novel called The Magic Island by William Seabrook. The book and inspired film uses Seabrook's experience with Haitian voodoo as he explored the island in the 1920s. While Frankenstein preyed on contemporary fears of modern science, White Zombie's horror quite obviously stems from the fear of black people, their cultures and mysticism, and the lands their peoples originated from. It should be to no one's surprise that Edgar Wallace's King Kong, which follows a similar theme of white exploration and conquest, was released a year later. In a brief synopsis of White Zombie, Madeline Short and her fiancé Neil Parker arrive in Haiti to meet a wealthy plantation owner called Charles Beaumont. Charles immediately becomes infatuated with Madeline and solicits a local voodoo priest's supernatural assistance. Madeline surreptitiously drinks the potion and, after appearing to die, is buried. Charles and the voodoo priest, named Murder, then go to her grave and resurrect her. Neil soon finds Madeline's grave empty and recruits the help of a missionary called Dr. Brunner. The two assault Charles's castle in which Madeline is being held and ultimately battle Charles, Murder, and his zombie brood. Eventually, Charles and Murder are overcome and Madeline awakens, once again herself, in Neil's arms. The subtext of this film is rather apparent, a suspiciously foreign man using African witchcraft to seduce a pure, virginal white woman. The modern zombie gained popular knowledge in 1986 CE after the release of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. The film features a hodgepodge mix of strangers in rural America who must evade a horde of undead ghouls. The film ends with the main protagonist Ben, awoken by an armed posse after defending the homestead from zombies. As he emerges from the cellar, he is mistaken for a zombie, gunned down by the posse, and is added to the zombie pyre. This film, created in the midst of the Vietnam War, was an obvious allegory for white hysteria in the mid-1900s America. The mindless violence conducted by the white zombies is only further exemplified when Ben, the film's only black character, is murdered by the fully cognizant white militia. The film is unabashedly gory and narrowly dodged the implementation of the Motion Picture Association of America rating system. Because of this, young teens were able to watch it, and it swiftly garnered a cult following. The film at the time was considered the most profitable horror film ever created due to its low production costs and popularity. In an interesting hiccup, the original distributor forgot to add the copyright symbol when changing the film's name. Because of this, the film entered public domain upon release, which only assisted in its popularity. Oddly, George Romero did not refer to the undead as zombies in his first film, instead referring to them as ghouls. He would later change the nomenclature to zombies in subsequent films and interviews, and thus from then on, the zombie had infected our films, TV shows, and popular culture. It seems that zombies were, rather ironically considering their Haitian origin, born to serve a function. That function was to make us subconsciously contemplate death and what leaves us when we finally rest. Even in prehistory, we as a species were terrified of the dead rising. The unnerving twitch or groan of a person we know to be dead is something we can all imagine. This isn't because of what the undead are, but more importantly what they are no longer. This is because we are, and still are, terrified of the incorporeal that makes us. It is easy to comprehend the corporeal. Most of our existence is born out of it. We can touch and sniff and smell, but to even begin exploring our souls is to be lost in a sea of stars. This is why this creature has followed us throughout millennia, from the shadows on cave walls to the silver screen and beyond. Because to be given the kind of kinesthetic movement that a zombie holds without the contemplative driving force of a soul, the very being of us, is what scares us. To see a human bereft of the element that makes us truly us.